Welcome back to renowned physicist Dr. Jeremy England, former professor of physics at MIT, author of Every Life is on Fire, currently a machine learning researcher in the biotech industry here in Israel. Shavua Tov, Dr. England.
Shavua Tov. I was thinking today about Parashat VaEra, which describes the beginning of the plagues in Egypt that Moshe starts to bring after telling Paro to let the people go. And I think we have in this series gotten to touch a bit before on some things that can be argued from that passage about connections to maybe biology and ideas of evolution. And VaEra, the tree of life, we had a shiur a while ago about that. But I've been realizing more recently some other things that we could try to pull out of the text that are related, but I think make a different point, and that will bring us back to dinosaurs a little bit. And then so I thought this would be a nice time to share some of those ideas. So where to begin? I think the first thing to say in general about the plagues, the Makot in Mitzrayim, is that they're very biological in nature, mostly. Not entirely, and the exceptions are interesting things to point to, and we'll get to that. But if you go through it, so there's blood, and then frogs, and then lice, and then either flies or wild animals, and then there's cattle disease and boils, and then we'll skip over the hail, because hail obviously is not, we don't usually think of it as a biological phenomenon, and then locusts, and then darkness is the other one where maybe, unless it's blindness actually, which is an interesting riff on perspective, but choshech, darkness, might not be anything biological. And then makat pechorot, we often think of as a plague in the sense of some kind of disease, although it's hard to imagine a disease that would selectively strike only the firstborn. But there is something actually biological that's different about the first issue of a womb. Although I think not in a way that, again, specifically targets one gender, but there's a lot we still don't understand about biology. So although it's hard to imagine a virus that would target the firstborn males of a whole society and also its cattle, it has an element of being like a disease. So 8 out of the 10 plagues, they seem very much like they bring us into the topic of biology. They're about animals or infectious agents or blood in some very basic sense, different kinds of animals and all the different sort of things that can happen with diseases of animals or diseases of people, or animals that eat other animals, like lice that eat people, etc. So it already fills you with this sense of that this is somehow about the complexity of life and all the different things that life can do to other life, and that makes hard life makes the biological dynamics of a system, makes life in that sense hard to predict, and it does kind of raise the question, why is that such a powerful theme in this central and emblematic set of events that are about bringing Bnei Israel out of Mitzrayim, bringing the Israelite nation into being, but also bringing it out of slavery in Egypt? And I think that there are different things that one can do with it, but one of the things that it does kind of have to be asked is, why are there exceptions to this? If that's the theme, then what is significant about the hail that we mentioned and the darkness? Why would those have to do with the biological story? Or if they don't, then why would there be such a strong bias towards all these other things that seem like it's all about, the Science Museum of Plants and Animals, and or not plants, and like animals and different kinds of creatures and the things that make them sick, etc. Why isn't it all just that from start to finish? And if it isn't that, then, why not have 5 of the plagues be geologic, where there's a tidal wave, and then there's a volcanic eruption, and then there's a lightning storm. You could have all sorts of things that happen that are also very destructive and frightening, and that seem to show Hashem's might, that don't have to do with the jungle or the zoo or whatever, however you want to put it, or the laboratory of petri dishes with infectious pathogens. But we don't have that, and yet we do have a bit of it seemingly. So then what role is that playing? I guess that's the question. That's one kind of question. Another question is, what is the significance of there being 10 plagues? Or maybe a different way of putting this, are there any other numbers that would have seemed more striking to us and suitable? Like, why wouldn't there, for example, be 7 plagues? Why would I think that? Well, this is a story about Hashem showing his supremacy over nature. And previously we've had 7 years of bumper crop and 7 years of famine, and the story of Joseph. We have lots of different 7s, and they all refer back to the idea of the 7 days of creation, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu made the world and he's master of it. And whenever we have things that seem to be about natural phenomena needing to take their time in their natural way, the number 7 seems to pop up here and there. And then we also have halachot that parallel that. So, we obviously have reason to find the number 10 significant as well. We have, the 10 commandments, for example. But 10 is not a number that maybe pops up quite as much. And also, I think it's a harder one to identify, like, what's the deep significance of the number 10 for us. And if this were really about Hashem showing his supremacy over nature, then it seems like maybe there would be 7 plagues, because it's about nature as being created by Hashem. So one point I want to make here, I don't know if I want to state it this, let's say, aggressively or controversially, is that in a sense there really are 7 plagues. The 7th plague might be thought of as the last 4, as it all roll into one. And there are a lot of reasons that you could try to build that up a bit from the text. At least, looking at just the last 3 plagues, the arbe, the choshech, the makat bechorot, in other words, the locusts and the darkness and the striking of the firstborn, that whole period in the story is all very rolled together with kind of cross-fertilizations of ideas. So, for example, with the arbe, we hear that there were so many that they blotted out the sun. So there's a sense of darkness. The locusts, so these locusts, this cloud of locusts they're so numerous, and they're going to eat all the food. So the locusts destroy a food supply. And actually, we're talking now about the 7th plague with the hail. The hail also destroys a food supply. The locusts are called death, as though it's like the striking of the firstborn, and they're blown away by an easterly wind, and the easterly wind is also there at the splitting of the sea. And there's a lot of different elements in that whole set of makot where when you look at one of them, you see an element in one of them that seems to be cropping up in another one. But I think that that would be kind of weak on its own, trying to argue how they roll together and what they have to do with each other. But I think another way of looking at it is to say the first 6 do seem to hang together in a way that can be, and other people have argued things like this, biologically and causally rationalized, right? Where you have a sequence of events, and you could imagine maybe that the first 6 all actually follow from one event, right? That if you turn the Nile River, the Meteor, into blood, in other words, you ruin this water supply and this giant ecosystem that's dependent on this enormous quantity of water, it turns to blood. In any case, it turns to something that is inhospitable to the life that normally lives there. what are the different things that happen? The fish die, then the frogs jump out, right? So there is a sense of a hostile environment. It kills some things that are there. Frogs are also living there, but they can get out, so they get out. So the first step, it just seems obvious that the frogs are a consequence of the blood in some sense. The frogs all left the river because they couldn't stay there anymore. And then, of course, once you have a bunch of dead frogs, which is how that plague ends, you either are going to have no one eating the flies because the frogs are all dead, and so you're going to have a lot more flies. Or if you have big piles of dead frogs everywhere, you're going to have a bunch of wild animals coming to try to eat the carcasses of the frog because it's like, free lunch. So either if you pile up a whole bunch of dead animals everywhere in your public places, or if you cause the mass extinction of a main predator that preys on insects, you're going to have arov, which some commentators say is insect, and some commentators say is wild animals. And you're also going to have kinim, because kinim are also insects, and so they roll together into this idea of like more insects, like more stuff that maybe the frogs somehow had to do with. So that gives you kinim and arov. And then dever, like once you have either a whole bunch of flies biting you or a whole bunch of wild animals roving around in your midst, then there's a transfer of disease from animal species. So you can either get disease from flies or you can get disease from other wild animals. Everyone in the world is so much more aware of this now after the last few years about the possibility of viruses transferring from one species of animal to another. And of course, you also can transfer viruses or other kinds of infectious agents from animals to people, right? So if we have dever, then to have shachin right afterwards, meaning like that there was this cattle plague, and then afterwards we have a plague of boils on people. I mean, the word dever in other contexts in halacha is used, or even in the Torah, is used to talk about diseases that strike people. So there was a dever striking the mikneh, the cattle, but it didn't stay there perhaps, and that's why people were getting boils. So the first 6 plagues, it just seems from start to finish, it's like you ruin the river, and then because the frogs all jumped out and then died, maybe you can explain everything else that happens as this chain reaction, this sort of crazy Rube Goldberg contraption or dominoes falling, or however you want to look at it. And then we get to the 7th Makkah, and that's Barad, which is hailstones falling from the sky. And there the train stops because there's no way you can think about, okay, and so then because everyone had boils, why would there be hail? Like you don't have an easy way of rationalizing how the weather is affected by things happening here on the ground, or even if that can happen to some degree, nothing in the story seems to really leap out at you about that. Of course, if the original reason that the river was turned to blood is somehow actually some kind of event in the broader world, geologic or otherwise, that could then be connected with changes in weather, then fine, but it becomes a stretch. It's not really an explanation of anything. But it's not so surprising that the 7th plague should somehow stand apart, right? Because we have this already from Shabbat and the 6 days of creation. We have 6 days of making the world, and that the mechanisms by which the natural world operates. And then the 7th day is separate and different and special. It's Kadosh. And the Barad suddenly takes us up to Shamayim and has this separateness and this distinction. So the hail, if it just stopped there, right, you might have, if you didn't know about the other 3 plagues that come afterwards, and you imagine a universe in which the Torah only had these 7 plagues and told you about them, that would feel actually quite natural, right? 7 is the sort of special number of nature in the Torah, and the 7th plague is devastating in a way none of them previously were, because instead of it just being about these kind of quirks and fluctuations of things that all can happen from biological relationships that are known and reasonable, you suddenly have this game-changing event coming from outside the system, so to speak, where blam, giant hailstones fall down from the sky, and it's just a bombardment that has there's no anticipating it, and there's no connecting it with previous events, and it much more strongly contains some kind of final seal, or as though Hakadosh Baruch Hu was finally just like dropping his hammer and smashing everything. And if that were how it ended, that would perhaps feel like it was enough, where, all right, so all these other things, maybe Paro, his heart was hardened and he wouldn't let them go. But then when the heavens opened and it was as though essentially the whole society had been destroyed by aerial bombardment, that finally made the point. But of course, we know it goes on from there, and that's not where the story stops. But we don't think about a possible connection between Barad, this dropping of the hail, and the remaining set of events. And I think there's good reason for that in one sense, but I think I'll suggest a kind of peculiar reading now, which might allow us in this present era to see that connection. And that is, going back to the beginning of the sequence of events of the Makot, there's something that happens right before the Makot that really is the kickoff. Because the kickoff is not the turning of the Nile to blood, but this mofet, this wonder that Moshe and Aaron go and show to Paro before it all starts, which is the turning of the staff of Aaron into a tanin. And we often roll these things together. Moshe's staff turns into a snake, and so Aaron's staff also turned into a snake, and we've all, so to speak, seen the movie. But the words are different, right? When Moshe's staff turns into a reptile, it turns into a nahash. And when the staff of Aaron turns into a reptile, it turns into a tanin. And the Torah is choosing its words carefully. There's a difference there. And it's before, when they're doing it before Paro, that sign is to be performed for Paro, and then it's by Aaron with his mate, and it turns into the tanin. So what are the different things that we can pull out of the tanin? Well, first of all, I think it calls our attention to the fact that there's a whole lot, not just about biology in the early plagues especially, but about kind of the genealogy and evolution of slimy, scaly creatures that live in the water. So what do I mean by that? First of all, the matot, the staves of Aaron and Moshe, are like branches of a tree, right? They're sticks. And Moshe and Aaron themselves are brothers. So Moshe and Aaron are related, but not the same. And they're like on branches on a tree. And their staves are different reptiles in a sense, right? You could argue maybe it's different words for the same thing, but we don't really have that in the text, so to speak. It's just two different words that we know both mean reptiles, and we don't know much more for certain about exactly what is the same or different about them. So by default, you would assume they're just different words for slightly different or possibly significantly different reptiles. So you have Nahash and Tanin, and it's like they're brothers, right? So there's the same sense of kinship relationship on a tree, with different branches of a tree representing kinship relationship between different reptiles. And so it's kind of this image of the tree of life and the relatedness of different reptiles to each other. And then we go to Dam, the river turns to blood. And then there's this thing which we observed in another shiur about how, from the perspective of the aquatic creatures in the river, there's this huge change in the quality of the environment. And it says explicitly that the fish die. So the fish in the river die. And if the frogs stayed there, they probably would die too, but they have the ability to leave in the way that the fish don't. So there's this sense of seeing evolution at work at some level, in that there is now an advantage to survival for something to crawl out of the water and try to survive on land. And frogs are exactly the kind of creature that are this transitional species that allows us to understand a bit about what it means to crawl out of the water, right? That if you see a bear, well, I guess bears swim around, but let's say if you see a giraffe, you don't think, oh, like that is descended from an aquatic creature. And if you see a fish, you think it doesn't have anything to do with what's going on in land, but amphibians are these boundary species. And even if we're not focusing on the genealogy of species that we get from modern study of evolutionary biology, frogs, because they're amphibians, go through this metamorphosis in their own observed life cycle, meaning that they start their life looking like a fish and they end their life with arms and legs and looking like a land creature. And so they very clearly, as an emblem or as a talisman, they recapitulate the idea of a transition from being a fish in the water to being a land creature that looks more reptilian. And so we started with, the tanin, showing it to Paro, and then we're kicking this off and we're looking at like fish turning into frogs and frogs going onto land. And it's reminding us about the sort of process by which you can get changes in environment that lead to changes in what different species are doing and whether they have the ability to adapt based on their differences in traits. And so there's all of this kind of raw material for thinking about biological evolution. But I'll also say about the tanin as this kickoff that it doesn't just evoke the idea of being reptilian. When we go back to the beginning, when we go back to Maaseh Bereshit, Hataninim Hagdolim, the giant or great or big taninim, serpents, reptiles, whatever you want to call them, they're specifically demarcated with this verb VaEra, that VaEra Elokim, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, he obviously created everything, but the verb root, boreh or bara, of creating is not used in connection with most of what's being described, but it is in connection dafka with the taninim gdolim. And so there's this sense somehow that the Torah wants to kind of call your attention to them as being like a special, significant thing that's being created. And I think that the association of those creatures with the sea in the description of Maaseh Bereshit, and the fact that they're big, they're explicitly described as being big, they're not just reptiles. They're the idea of the primordial reptilian beast of yesteryear, which mythically in the ancient world and in the imagination of humanity as a whole is dragons and sort of celestial slash primordial, not celestial, I would say more like subterranean, primordial beast creatures that people tell stories about it. But why are they always telling stories about these sort of very, very scary giant dragon type things that are at the beginning of time and then the gods had to slay them or whatever, or put them in some prison? It's because they're walking around the world and they're finding sometimes bones of giant reptile skeletons that look very intimidating and scary, and they can tell that they're reptiles from their skeletons, and they look much bigger than any reptiles anyone's ever seen. And that's just part of the human experience. That's part of what we have here in the world. It's like bones shaped like giant reptiles. Rocks shaped like bones of giant reptiles. And without putting any 20th and 21st century interpretive frame on that empirical evidence, there is always the question for a human being: what do you make of that? When you crack open a rock and you find that, and I think that obviously has made its way into the human imagination since a long time ago. So you have in these very pre-modern reactions to it, if you look in like the mythologies of the ancient Mediterranean, all of these kind of primordial ancient beast kind of stories, or just the idea of dragons or what have you. And so in the present era, obviously we're going to talk about those fossils and say, okay, let's talk everything about what we know about dinosaurs. And so I think it's fair to say, just in shorthand, that the tanin is the idea of the dinosaur. And I am fully willing to admit that dinosaurs as a modern developed concept, maybe we're not necessarily going to expect the Torah to mean the same thing, and it's maybe going to refer more to the kind of universal human experience of the idea of one of these giant reptiles where we're not sure as much, that we know as much about who they are and where they came from. But I think that the connection to the sea also is what really clinches this idea, because the sea, aside from the fact that the sea is kind of the unknown, where when you're riding on a boat, you see kind of like a piece of something below the surface, and you can maybe imagine how giant it is. There are some big creatures in the sea, like whales and giant squids and things, and you maybe only see a piece of them. It's also that, you can be hiking on a mountain and crack open a rock near the top of the mountain and find like a fossil of what looks like a sea creature that you saw at the beach inside that rock. And so the idea of the sea is also the idea of, in our lexicon, in the Torah framework, of the Mabul, of the flood, like the idea of an era previously that sort of got swept over, and it doesn't, there was some kind of regime in place that has been toppled, and so thoroughly and decisively that it has only these kind of trace remnants. But I think the sea, you can argue, is going to be an element of that idea, because we, if you're not now talking about, the general experience of the human being, you don't find fossils in the water because you're not walking around on the seafloor. So you find fossils on land. And when you find fossils on land that look like land creatures, it doesn't really strike you the same way. But if you find fossils on land that look like sea creatures, that really is going to kind of stand out, because there's something extremely puzzling about that. And so I think that, again, the idea of the Taninim Gudolim as being sea creatures also maybe connects with that element, this idea of specifically the mysteriousness of what you can find that's fossilized, even on land. So if we'll accept that claim and run with it a bit, that the Tanin is this dinosaur emblem, you could call it a dragon emblem, you could call it a, sea monster emblem, depending on how sort of mythic you want to be about what kinds of human ideas it taps into or evokes. But I think for our purposes here, since we're thinking about biology, I want to call it a dinosaur emblem. We kick things off with that, and then we see these 6 makot, these 6 plagues of just biology kind of happening in the snow globe, where a perturbation where the river turns to blood causes this chain reaction, and everything that's happening is kind of rationalizable, and this could follow from that, and this could follow from that. And it's a unexpectedly calamitous chain of events, but it always may be somehow understandable in terms of just the ebb and flow and fluctuations of all these different pieces of the living world and how they relate to each other, right? Like the kinim starts you off understanding that this is complicated because some living things live on other living things, and you get ecology, and you get a whole lot of different A affects B and B affects C kind of things happening. And that's indeed what you see, I think, when you go from start to finish with the first 6 makot. And then you get to number 7, and it seems like a complete departure and doesn't have to do with the theme anymore, right? Because now it's hail, which is weather, and it kills some things, and then we go back to biology and say, okay, so there's locusts, like so we're kind of still talking about living things. And then there's darkness again, an inexplicable darkness, doesn't seem to have to do with anything. And then finally Makat Bechorot, which is kind of unique in a way, but maybe is still continuing the theme of disease. So what is the unifying theme, and what do these makot have to do with each other? So the peculiar proposal that I want to make now is that if you have the idea of the dinosaurs, it turns out there is an opportunity to roll these last few makot together. Because what is it that we now say to ourselves about what happened to the dinosaurs, right? Based on geologic evidence and other kinds of analyses and examinations people do of the fossil record, and looking for craters and other things. And so the idea, the prevailing idea among paleontologists, geologists, is that there was a massive meteorite impact, and that obviously that had some primary impact destructive force that could have killed a lot of stuff. but that also subsequently, what do you get from that? You're going to get all sorts of problems with the food supply that are going to result from darkness, right? Because if you have a giant impact, it will throw up a whole lot of dust, and then the dust blocks out the sun, and the world gets cold and not so sunny. And as a result, the amount of plant matter that can grow is significantly less. And suddenly the whole ecosystem is really walloped because you have all of these giant dinosaurs that need to eat tons of plants, and there aren't enough plants anymore. And so they start dying. And then as a result, the carnivores that eat them start dying, and the whole system kind of collapses. And so, that's a theory, and it's a theory that no matter how much evidence you amass in the present, someone can always say, well, but you maybe don't know enough to really be sure. But there is a giant crater in the Yucatan that is considered to be a plausible location for an impact that could have had this effect. And so a lot of effort has gone into pushing the collecting and sort of presenting evidence in support of this theory. And I hesitate on the one hand. I always hesitate to try to understand things in Torah through the lens of ideas that came from outside of Torah that are, in a sense, theories that can be tested or disproven, and they may be prevailing at the moment, but sometimes it's because there may still need to be progress in human understanding so that another theory could replace it. But what's also true is that sometimes the ideas are, let's say, general enough that even if the exactness of the current theory is not going to remain the same, that there are themes that are, let's say, strong enough in the understanding of the fundamental situation that they would be available to the intuition of prophetic insight. And it doesn't need to be the case that, so to speak, Chazal or the Hebrew prophets, Moshe Rabbeinu or whoever, had the equivalent of a course in 21st century paleontology in order to be able to write things a certain way. Obviously, at some level, if it all comes from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, can contain and bespeak any level of understanding. But I think we're still, bound to be always asking the question, to what degree are the details of a view of the world that we have in the present ones that we should consider to be part of that when we're looking at a text that has this kind of timelessness and is trying to speak in terms that are not particular to our time. But I think, there are things about the way the world works that could either consciously or even unconsciously in the intuition of a Navi, right? They could work their way in. Meteor impacts large enough to destroy the dinosaurs don't happen every day, but meteor impacts of some size do happen. And people, once they know that there is an empirical phenomenon of these things that can rain down from the sky and cause tremendous damage, that immediately enters into your thought process about, well, if there were beasts much bigger than me that could clearly eat me alive because I'm holding a fossil of one of its teeth or whatever, then what could be powerful enough to destroy such terrible beasts? And really, modern science has not come up with such a different explanation than that, right? It's saying that maybe there's an explanation in a meteor impact. But now you can see where I'm going here, right? When we get to plague number 7, what's plague number 7? It's barad, which we call hail. And hail, obviously, in its more sort of colloquial and mundane meteorological version, is just balls of ice that form in the clouds and they fall down, and sometimes they can be big and they can start to be dangerous because they've fallen very far and are pretty dense and heavy. Although it's interesting that Chazal specifically in their Midrash say that the hail that fell, the barad, had fire in it, which makes it less than normal hail, or certainly something greater than normal hail, perhaps is a better way of putting it. And obviously more strongly evokes the meteoric kind of quality. So if we just play with that notion a little bit, and we'll find, okay, what are the things that happen? The barad falls, and let's call that a meteor impact. So there's a meteor impact, and that is a departure from the biological theme of the first 6 makot, but it does actually now stay in step with the overall trajectory of the story, because the story is about biology, and the story about dinosaurs is a story about biology, but it contains a meteor in it. Why? Because the meteor changed the environment. You have this primarily massively destructive event, which the Barad is also described as being. It kills all the animals that are outside, so to speak. But then what happens afterwards? The food supply is going to disappear. And in the description of the Torah, that's because of the arbe, because of the locusts. But the point is that, arbe just refers to multitude, right? So locusts are a specific species of animal that, can be very multitudinous and come and eat all your food. But also at another level, if we're talking about the dinosaurs, like the problem was exactly that there were multitudes and they were eating all the food and there wasn't enough food. So you have this contraction in the food supply caused by the impact. And there's now a bunch of mouths to feed. And if you combine that with the next makah, which is choshech, darkness is the other thing that we have associated with this theory of how the dinosaurs may have been wiped out. The idea that an impact could actually change the degree to which the sun is, able to shine on the earth because of all the sort of dust and things thrown up that are blocking access to the sun. So these 3 plagues, the barad, the arbe, and the choshech, clearly, no one would read those and say, oh yeah, it's obvious, and that's exactly the same thing as talking about how paleontologists talk about dinosaurs. But once you are thinking about taninim, dolim, once you know this, the whole thing is kicked off with a dinosaur, and then it carries us through the other makot, which is really about like slimy, creepy, crawly things like amphibians and reptiles, coming out of the water, coming onto the land, and evolving, changing from fish into amphibians, and implicitly then changing from from amphibians into reptiles. I'll say as an aside, by the way, that the snake, the nachash, is another emblem of this, right? Because the nachash is obviously a reptile, but has no legs. So there's another sense of it's an emblem of further evolution, like that things just keep changing. The forms of animals can change over time. And Chazal were so alive to this that they even have this midrash saying that the Nachash in Gan Eden actually had arms and legs, and then he lost them, when he decided to get involved in human politics and religion. But so that's a very much an aside. But the point is that once you're filling your head with all of this stuff about dinosaurs and reptiles and evolution and biology and the events of the world kind of all having to do with the connection between different things in the biological ecosystem, the barad and the choshech, the sort of meteor impact or, giant ice balls falling from the sky, and the darkness, they're not out of that pattern anymore because they're part of the environment's effect on life, right? That there are sudden changes in environment. And that is part of the story of how life's evolution progresses ecologically and otherwise, right? So either ecosystems can change and be destroyed, or animal forms can change over time because of the variations that you had in the population and things being wiped out by changes in environment. So you have a story really from start to finish that's about biological evolution, and that's bringing in this idea of the dinosaurs, and even kind of in what I find to be, at least you could call it amusing or you could call it striking, in a somewhat surprising way, better paralleling than we might have imagined the story we tell about how the dinosaurs died in modern scientific terms. And that rolls these last makot all together in some sense. Like the barad is indeed the hammer dropping, and then all these other things are consequences perhaps of that. And then what it ends with is makat bechorot. And that I think is, there we have to look and say, like, what is the point of all of this? Okay, so it's interesting. Everything I've been saying maybe is like up to this point, you could call it an amusing or intriguing set of observations. But as I've said many times, the Torah does not do this just to amuse us. It has a point to make always. It's always about understanding something about the mission of Avdei Hashem. What is HaKadosh Baruch Hu want us to do? How does he want us to understand the world so that we can serve him in it? And I think where this lands maybe is on actually a simple point that we often hear made in other terms, but is suddenly getting made in a very cosmic way that has to do with everything about what lives on Earth, and that is that the striking of the firstborn is HaKadosh Baruch Hu's way of sending the message that the one who comes into the world first and therefore is bigger and therefore has the advantage and the head start and may therefore have some kind of balance of power in his favor, that he doesn't necessarily stay in charge or on top forever. The firstborn of Egypt we think of as being, about someone's position within a family. And of course, indeed, that was the case. But there's now the symbolic idea of what it means to be the Behor, what it means to be the firstborn. That goes to a broader range of concepts, right? So it refers also to being the first, let's say, mighty animals to come into being, right? What were the dinosaurs? They were the rulers of the earth. And that's a concept, again, that I think really you should think of as being pre-modern. That's the whole notion of you find the skeleton of the giant reptile that could have swallowed you whole in sort of etched in the rock. And then you're contemplating the fact that there were seemingly in the past, so to speak, rulers of the earth who could have ruled over you, but they've somehow been laid low, right? You don't see them anymore. They're gone. Their time is done. And that in the mythic consciousness of humanity, I think is why you have all these stories about, oh, well, there was this earlier period with these like really scary monsters, but then the gods, slew them all or tamed them or put them in a cage, underneath the earth or whatever it is. There's a very deep human consciousness of like, there are things that came before us and they used to rule and then they've been flung low. And so the idea then is the dinosaurs as living beings in some sense are the firstborns. They're not actually firstborn, right? Obviously lots of things came before the dinosaurs, but they represent the idea of a Behor of zoology or of the tree of life that had strength and size and all this sort of advantage. And this even is consistent, also with what people think about when you try to understand the impact of the change of the environment that led to the death of dinosaurs, right? That may have cleared the decks and made room for mammals to come into being. So there's an element of parallelism even there with this idea that there's a kind of a competition between what comes earlier and what comes later. And there's kind of a default assumption that if you came first and you got to eat first and you're bigger and you're stronger, that you can dominate. And I think what we now have to ask is, what does this have to do with the story, right? Like, it's happening not at a random point in the Torah, it's happening in Yetziat Mitzrayim, in the leaving of Egypt. So why there? And maybe that's the most obvious part of all of this, right? It's because it's talking about Mitzrayim. It's talking about the ancient Egyptian empires. It's talking about the pharaohs, right? Who regarded themselves as the firstborn of humanity, right? They were the first truly great ancient civilization, right? Where when everyone else was still, so to speak, scrabbling in the dirt, they had already for like 1,000 years been building giant stone monuments and producing huge amounts of food and having a, very structured caste system and all of this natural philosophy or science, if you want to call it that, and a very rich mythology that created an ideological system that supported a functioning society and all of this stuff. So they were the Bechor in their own self-regard, right? They thought of themselves as like, we're first, and we therefore know the most and have the most strength and power and wealth, and it's our right. And it's not even a right, but it's like the natural state of affairs that we should dominate forever. And the message from Hakadosh Baruch Hu, I think, to get it most precisely, we have to go back to this event with the Mateh, where it turns into a Tanin, right? Because it's not, if our point were just to make the case that somehow Mitzrayim are the dinosaurs, Mitzrayim are the Taninim, then maybe it would be somehow simple enough to say, okay, you're the dinosaurs, and look, now the dinosaurs are just remnants of bones and the stones and the earth, and you two will be that. You'll be flung low, and even though you're mighty and you think you're the Bechor, the striking of the firstborn of Egypt is going to be a sign that HaKadosh Baruch Hu can take those who have power and those who have advantage and lay them low and make room for something else. But there's an element at the beginning of the story with the Taninim that I think actually parallels the end of the story with the fact that the firstborn of Bnei Israel are not struck. So it's not just that there's a striking of firstborns. There's also some element of, okay, there's another kind of firstbornness that can exist, which is somehow protected. So yes, Mitzrayim at some level are kind of the firstborn of human civilizations, and they're going to be laid low, and it's going to show the world that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is king. He's king over nature. He's king over all of biology and all of human history. And that is part of the message, certainly. But then there's also this, if you go to Aaron's Mateh, his Mateh is a Tanin, and also the magicians of Pharaoh make Taninim. They make, their staves into whatever these reptiles is that you want to call them. But then his Tanin swallows their Tanin, right? That's the other, his staff swallows their staffs. So there's something about the Tanin that Aaron made that has this kind of greater supremacy, like that it's a different kind of dinosaur. And I think that parallelism works at both ends, because what is the Mateh of Aaron? It's the staff that later on, when Korach is having his rebellion, and also when, by the way, Korach and his rebels are getting swallowed up by the earth. And so there's a repetition of themes that, we could also bring into the discussion of dinosaurs, because it's a connected passage. But there's this rebellion of Korach, and there's a competition afterwards where each Mateh puts out, the leader of the Mateh puts his staff out, and Aaron's Mateh flowers with shkedim, with these, almond blossoms. And that's supposed to be a sign that Aaron's, and Kehuna, his priesthood is correct, and that Shevet Levi has been specially selected. But what's the point there? I think the point is that there is also a firstbornness, or a sort of like first out the door kind of quality, or first out of the gate kind of quality that's being expressed in that sign. The shkedim, right, are the flower that blooms earliest in the season. We're about to have, so the theme of this also is this year is the upcoming Tu B'Shvat, celebration that we have, where, we now in modern Hebrew in Israel sing a song about, Tu B'Shvat Higia, and it says Hashkedia Porachat, like the almond flower is blossoming. That's the first flower that you get in the season, right? So the shkedim, it's not the only flower. So it's not the case necessarily that the other branches, the other matot, the other staves, the other tribes are not going to flower in their own way. It's that what Aaron represents is he's the shaked, so he flowers first, And that does lead to a special status and difference that's conferred on Shevet Levi for all time. But the point is that the reason that kind of Bechorah, that kind of firstbornness, is going to be protected and not struck down in the way that HaKadosh Baruch Hu strikes down the dinosaurs and strikes down Mitzrayim, is that it's not, I'm firstborn, so I rule over you and I'm going to dominate you and I'm going to control you and I'm going to win and you're going to lose. It's that you have all the different staves laid out together. And we don't usually pick up on this, but when our own staff flowers with the shkedim, the fact that those are the flowers that blossom first, what it's reminding us of is that there are other flowers that can flower later. And we're one nation made up of all these different tribes. And it is not the case that Aaron gets flowers and you get nothing, right? Or that Levi gets flowers and you get nothing. So this was a contest. Levi won. Everyone lives for the rest of eternity under his boot. It's that we're one nation and we all get to flower and produce the different, wonderful fruits that we can see in Eretz Yisrael. But the Shkedia will do that first. And that first flowering does lead to a special status, but it's a special status of Kehuna that is about a different role in serving Hashem. And really, now when you think where are the almond flowers in the Mikdash, they're in the cups of the menorah that we fill with oil to make light. So it's about a special role for Aaron and Shevet Levi to light the way for the whole nation. But the rest of the nation gets to flower too and be part of the story. And they're not thrown down and they're not subjugated to the Bechorah of Aaron. They just have a separate and different status. And that's what we see at the other end as well, that protection of the Bechorim, of Bnei Israel. Why do they not die when you have the striking of the firstborn of Mitzrayim? It's because of Korban Pesach, right? It's because of the performance of this mitzvah that turns the home, as Rav Grossman has argued very convincingly and eloquently, I think, at other times, turns the home into a mikdash where the doorway is the altar, and you're creating, to the degree that was possible in Mitzrayim in this first moment when they're leaving, you're creating this emblem of Avodat Hashem with a mikdash and a mizbeach with a temple and an altar, and where the Jewish home becomes the kind of the foundation on which that's built. So to close up, I think that at some level you can take or leave whether you think that there's really a deep connection to the idea of dinosaurs here. I couldn't help, sharing this observation about the barad. Once you start realizing, if you turn it around a little bit, it reminds you more than you might expect of the story of meteors, causing the mass extinction of the dinosaurs. And there is certainly at least this idea of primordial reptiles at the beginning of all of this, and this question of like who gets to rule and who gets to be the firstborn. And that, I would argue, is a clear theme in the Makot as a whole, that the early Makot, the first 6 Makot, are about, let's say, the ecosystem as it is, and just showing that everything that happens in there, however unpredictable, is actually always the Ratzon of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And then you suddenly have the hammer drop from outside the system, which is also from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And it's like, whatever you think the system is, you always aren't looking far enough outside it to realize the things that can come in and completely change the game. And that the succession of events from that point onward is really one process that's initiated by this cataclysmic event from Shemayim. And it ends with Makat Bechorot. It ends with the fall of the firstborn. But the point there is, it's not just about certain sons of people who had their sons first in Mitzrayim. It's about Mitzrayim as the firstborn of nations, the firstborn, let's say, of civilizations, being taught a lesson for humanity, for Bnei Israel to convey to humanity for all time, that just because you're first to grow and first to prosper and first to have power, that doesn't give you the right to dominate and subjugate humanity for all time. And your time will come, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu will decide when you're thrown down from your pyramid or pedestal, or however you want to think of it, and something or someone else will rise in your place. But in contrast, Bnei Israel, because Bnei Israel's notion of what the exceptionality of Shevet Levi is, that kind of Bechorah that Shevet Levi was granted in the flowering of the Mate of Aaron, because that is an inclusive Bechorah, which creates separateness and a separate responsibility to serve and to light the way, but doesn't lead to subjugation or oppression or exclusion or defeat, for the others, where there can be one nation with many different kinds of flowers, and there's just one flower that came first, and that led the way for the others. That is the kind of Bechorah that HaKadosh Baruch Hu can embrace and uphold and celebrate. And that's demonstrated whether you want to look at it through the lens of the Mate of Aaron, or eventually as well when considering Korban Pesach and the actual mechanics of this event with Makat Bechorot, when we're finishing up the last plague before Yetziat Mitzrayim.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. If you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.